Welcome to this lesson on one of most GMAT test takers' least favorite content areas for the verbal, denser reading comprehension passages. So first, just how frequently you'll see these types of questions. So you're generally going to want to assume that 1 to 2 of the passages of the 4 assumed passages per verbal section are going to be this denser reading comprehension, where you basically are going to have a single longer paragraph about a technically specific topic that you probably don't have a whole lot of background information about or familiarity with. Now, these are potentially reading comprehension style content, so you can see these obviously in the verbal section, but they also could be integrated reasoning, multi-source reasoning, or two-part analysis content. So remember that on the verbal section, you really aren't going to want to skip these for time because you quickly can miss 2, 3, 4 questions in a row. Same thing if this is content on the integrated reasoning for multi-source reasoning, you probably need to engage with it. However, if it's a two-part analysis question, you may have a little bit more flexibility to just say, hey, this is one that's going to take me too long and I'm going to guess and move on, understanding that it's just going to affect that one two-part analysis slide. Now, strategic implications, you always have to read carefully and slowly to ensure that you comprehend the possibly harder content. So one thing you cannot do is just have your eyes glaze over and read through the passage and go, yeah, I read it, but I recall nothing. This engagement through the dense reading comprehension passage mapping that we're going to talk about in a moment is to safeguard against that kind of, I read it and it felt like it went in my eyes and through the back of my head, I comprehended nothing. So you do, however, when you're working through this specific, and honestly all reading comprehension and to a degree critical reasoning note-taking processes, want to consider using the online whiteboard text box. Now, we haven't talked much about the online whiteboard because it really isn't helpful in the quantitative, and for process of elimination purposes, it's not really helpful either. So you're just going to engage with either your physical whiteboard in person, which is those little flippable sheets, or the whiteboard that's erasable that you're allowed on the online GMAT administration. But there is on the at-home administration the functionality of an online whiteboard. It really doesn't help for things like long division, but if you want to type out notes, it may be faster than handwriting it on your physical whiteboard, whichever type of whiteboard you have. So consider using that to type out the notes. I'm actually going to be typing out the notes myself in illustration, both here, well, not really here in the presentation, but on our whiteboard, I'm actually going to be typing because it is, at least for me, faster to type than to handwrite. So something you might want to consider. Also, you'll want to use initials or shorthand to simplify unfamiliar jargon or acronyms. So if you're being introduced to a new concept and you're like, UAF47 asteroid 6, and you're like, okay, I don't know what that is. I'm just going to put A6. All of that numbering nomenclature is irrelevant, basically. And I just say A6 means that asteroid that we described. So what you want to do is make it almost into a variable, especially if it's just lengthy, and don't waste time doing things like trying to mentally pronounce scientific names, weird, and just terms that are really long. It's a waste of time, and you can just shorthand it for the purposes of what you need in working through these reading comprehension passage questions. And of course, you do have to synthesize the information as you go, and you'll want to note the location of your subject matter in future questions to better answer them, because the purpose of the map is to not just engage with the passage, but tell you where to go back and get information. So you hopefully are able to refer to your notes and go, okay, I know exactly where that subject matter is. So let's take a look at a sample dense passage. So just how do we engage with these dense passage maps? First, you want to read a sentence and write a brief note summarizing its content. And you're basically saying that if I don't engage with it immediately, I'm not really retaining anything. Then you're just going to read the next sentence and write a note about it, summarizing the content and building a narrative from the prior sentence note. So you're just kind of building it out for yourself and saying, okay, here's what we're talking about. Again, consider black boxing content you cannot define for yourself or that seemingly requires outside knowledge with initials or shorthand. So we're just not even going to care about certain terms here in a moment and be like, yeah, I don't know what that means. That's okay. You're not expected to be, say, a botanist for this passage. It just isn't required. Also note, you generally, when you engage with these dense reading comprehension notes, the summaries become shorter the further you go along in the passage because you got a better idea of what's happening. by the time you reach the end of the paragraph. And lastly, because you've been so detailed, you really, in most cases, do not need to overall summarize the passage at the end of the map. You kind of know the whole thing by way of working through it deliberately throughout. So let's dense passage map this. So we're going to start with the first sentence. Given its rugged coastline and dearth of safe boat landings, ancient foraging on Anacapa Island must have been relatively challenging. So we're just going to make that Anacapa Island AI. It doesn't matter that it's Anacapa Island, but we know that AI, it was hard to have foraged a long time ago due to the rugged coast and no safe boat landings. Now, that's what dearth means. And dearth means no safe, and you want to use your terms. If you don't know what dearth means, you just say something about boat landings. If you don't know, that's okay. Just make sure it's kind of open-ended, because we got to at least know that's where we're talking about boat landings. Then we read the next sentence. Today, fresh water is found only in an isolated spring with no perennial running water on any of the island segments. Okay, so that means today, AI, only fresh water in one spring. Simple enough. And you can see, I just keep AI as Anacapa Island. Not going to write that out ever again. Then we got to the next sentence, and here we've got vegetation is currently dominated by coastal bluff scrub and coastal sage shrub. You can see I immediately just call that CBS and CSS. CBS and CSS dominate AI vegetation, with trees and shrubs limited primarily to 2 protected gullies on the northern slope of West Anacapa and at Shepherd's Landing on Middle Anacapa. These details don't really matter, so I just say trees and shrubs limited to 2 places in West and Middle AI. If we care about it being Shepherd's Landing, we'll get that information later. I just need to know that these CBS and CSS dominate the AI vegetation and trees and shrubs are elsewhere, whatever CBS and CSS mean. So then we've got California sea lions and harbor seals are commonly seen in the waters and rocks around the island, but the absence of extensive beaches except at Frenchie's Cove on West Anacapa limits the area for pinnipeds to haul out. Now, another term that you might go, pinnipeds, what's that? Well, logically, it's probably the seals and the sea lions. But we can shorthand this as well, sea lions and seals in water around the AI, but no beaches to rest in. And again, limits the areas for pinnipeds to haul out. If you can understand that, it means there's no beaches for them to rest on. Simplify it for yourself. The rocky coasts of Anacapa support rich rocky intertidal and kelp forest ecosystems, and the island is more exposed to the warm southerly waters of the California countercurrent than some of the other northern channel islands. So again, going to simplify that, AI has rich intertidal and kelp forest ecosystems. The stuff about the waters you can choose to include or not, but I probably will know where that is as well. And remember that we said that as you get further into the passage, you generally can go a little bit shorter. Then we've got the next sentence. So steep slopes of the island made it hard, difficult for people to bring marine resources to sites on the top of the island, although access may have been easier in the past. And you can see that summarized in sentence 6. Steep slopes make hard to reach top of island, may have been easier before. Take it at its basis. And then lastly, we've got Anacapa Island. So AI hosts enormous colonies of nesting birds, especially western gulls. I don't care about their technical name. And brown pelicans, again, don't care about their technical name. The latter of which use Anacapa and Santa Barbara Islands as a primary nesting area along the west coast of the United States. So sentence 7, many nesting bird colonies, especially WG and BP, brown pelicans, western gulls, which use AI and SBA, Santa Barbara Islands, and our well-known Anacapa Island at this point, as the primary U.S. West Coast nesting area. Simple enough. But again, I recognize that it will take a little bit of time. So now, let's use this map and what we've talked about to engage with the questions. And just by the act of going deliberately, and the map's going to disappear just because I've only got so much room on the screen, we probably know where information is at this point of the process. We've got a sample detail question here asking, according to the passage, each of the following can be presently found on Anacapa Island AI, except. And we know that when we see the except, we basically have to do the opposite. So in this case, we're basically looking for what cannot presently be found on AI. So we start with choice A, and we remember where the sea lions are. So it says California sea lions are commonly seen in the waters and rocks around the island, and it's a little bit of a trap. It says the absence of extensive beaches except at Frenchie's Cove on West AI. So sea lions are there. We also see that harbor seals are there as well. So it talks about both sets. So that's all right there in that sentence. Now, protected harbors, you may say, I don't recall that, and you wouldn't be wrong. So that wasn't in our passage map from before, so we'll just use a little squiggle there and say we're going to hold that. We don't remember it, and it wasn't in our map. Now, freshwater, right up there. Freshwater is found only in an isolated spring, but that means that it's there, so that's eliminated. And then the nesting birds, we remember that down towards the end, and we've got those gulls and pelicans. Now, for protected harbors, we'd select this if it were the exam, but just to prove out that it was mentioned, in the very first sentence, it says, given its rugged coastline and dearth of safe boat landings. So that means that there are not, in fact, protected harbors, so we'd select that option confidently if we remember that piece. But again, they like to use an unfamiliar paraphrase, and that's how you protect yourself against, just eliminating something that you're like, I didn't see that. That's not a good reason to eliminate on this exam. So we'd hold protected harbors and ultimately select it. Now, a sample purpose question. And remember that on the exam, oftentimes they'll actually highlight the relevant information. So we've got it highlighted here, and it just says the reference to Frenchie's Cove is most likely intended to. So we remember that intended to means that we're looking for why is it there. So we'd want to read around that, but we already kind of know. It's to give a location where the sea lions and harbor seals can haul out. That's the information right around it. And we got that from the passage map. So hopefully not a huge need to go back into the passage to get further information. So choice A, provide an exception to a general state of affairs. Again, use the squiggle. You're like, yeah, Frenchie's Cove is the one place where they're able to come out. So that's a possibility, although not really loving the option at the outset, kind of bland. Moving through the remainder of the choices, remember, once you've got something that's okay, you can maybe move a little bit more quickly, but explain why the animals are present there. It doesn't explain it. It doesn't say why they do that. This is just the exception, so it's not explaining anything. Alternative hypothesis, what alternative hypothesis? So that's out. Differentiate between two instances of the same occurrence. What same occurrence? That's out. And question the validity of anecdotal evidence. No, we're not questioning whether or not they come out here. So our answer has to be choice A. Again, relatively easy once you make sure that you've engaged and understood the passage overall. And our last question for this passage of example is an inference question. So with which of the following statements regarding the vegetation of AI, again, shorthanded, would the author most likely agree? So we have to find the term. And there it is, vegetation. So we've got to read around at least a sentence above and through that sentence that's there. Again, we know that the next sentence is about sea lions, so we don't need to necessarily go past that. And again, the upfront passage map helps determine how much is required to read. But today, freshwater is found only in an isolated spring with no perennial running water on any of the island segments. As a result, so kind of bringing that conjunction to 4, we know what the result is coming from. Vegetation is currently dominated by CBS, coastal bluff scrub. I don't know what a coastal bluff scrub is, but I'm going to just call it CBS, and coastal sage scrub, again, CSS. With trees and shrubs limited primarily to 2 protected gullies on the northern slope of West AI and at Shepherd's Landing on Middle AI. So again, simplifying it for ourselves, and our prediction is really quite concise. We just know that the vegetation is dominated by CBS and CSS. So, coastal scrubs are best adapted to an island environment. Well, we don't know that they're best adapted. They are maybe better than these trees and shrubs, but best adapted is extreme. We can eliminate choice A. Many trees and shrubs require groundwater sources to flourish. Oh, so we've got isolated spring and no perennial running water. So that means there's no water tied to these trees, and it's because of this that the vegetation is dominated by the CBS and CSS. So this actually matches pretty well to the passage if you synthesize the information. A surplus of freshwater vegetation can lead to a water shortage. Well, we don't have much freshwater vegetation, and we don't know what would happen if there was too much of it, so that can be eliminated pretty confidently once you understand what the sentences are saying. Protected gullies are necessary to support most island plant life. Again, most island plant life necessary. We can't make that logical leap, even though we can see that it's probably required for these trees and shrubs on West AI, but to go outside of that is probably too far. And then Cooler northerly waters can suppress biological diversity. Well, those northerly waters, we talked about the southerly waters, and we mentioned how we, just kind of left that out. But we remember where that is, and it's not here when we're talking about vegetation. So you have to focus on the subject. You have to focus on the location. Don't extrapolate to the larger passage when you're engaging with a specific inference question such as this. But we confidently select B at this point. So here's our process when we're engaging with these dense reading comprehension passages. Consider executing a detailed passage map first. So determine the need for a sentence-by-sentence passage map. You've got to commit and you've got to decide early. But if you do it, you just have to work through the pieces and take that shorthand summary note for each sentence as you go. Then you're going to identify the question, subject, and task as you go along. So determine what to look for using the passage map for your location as you individually address each question. Then, of course, read what you need. At least one sentence above and below is the default, unless it was like we just saw, where we're clearly moving on to talking about seals, and seals have nothing to do with vegetation, to guarantee proper context. Then make your own prediction, just as we did previously. Remember that it depends on the question task, what you're being asked for. So when you're looking at a detail, what did the passage say about that thing? When you're being asked about purpose, why did the passage say it? When you're asked about inference, what must be based on the statements about that subject matter. And if you've got an application question task, what matches it in some fashion, or potentially kind of critical reasoning in reading comprehension. And then process of eliminate. And remember that you need to focus on actions and descriptions for objective reasons to eliminate. You got to be able to say why it's wrong, it's extreme, it's a reversal, introduces a new variable, something specific. And when you're down to 2, default to selecting that option with fewer direct terms from the passage and go bland. So just as we do with everything reading comprehension, because we know that the exam is trying to obscure what the right answer is by using unappealing language. So let's hop on over to the whiteboard and take a look at another passage and illustrate once more how to address these denser passages through a detailed passage map. So we've got another dense reading comprehension passage here on the whiteboard, as well as a question. Now, if this were the first question of the passage, you might just take a moment to decide, do I want to read this specifically for just the term referenced elegant experiments, or do I want to engage with the whole thing? And again, this is a really dense technical passage, as you can already kind of see just from the italicized terms and just the manner in which it's constructed. So we're going to say that we're going to just go ahead and engage with the upfront passage map. So we start by reading the initial sentence. So we're just going to have S1 here. And scuba-based observations and experiments help promote the idea that positive interactions among species play key roles in the maintenance of biodiversity by facilitating the persistence of habitats created by foundation species, which are now often called physical ecosystem engineers. Wow, there's a lot happening in there. So we need to distill it to just its most important facts. And the fact that it's we've got this thing that's now called the physical ecosystem engineer, they want you to focus on that. That's not the most important thing. The most important thing is the subject. And the subject is scuba-based observations and experiments. So we know that scuba, obs for observations, and experiments, EXPs for experiments, promote idea that species interaction, so SI, are key in BD for biodiversity. Simple enough. That's all I really need to start so that I can engage with it and go, okay, this is what we're talking about. We've got scuba observations, and these observations and experiments have promoted the idea that species interactions are key in biodiversity. And we'll just simplify that, or kind of further that, by key to maintain biodiversity. So just, give it a little bit more like actual English phrasing here. But then we're going to move on to sentence 2. And if we thought the first one was dense, let's look at this thing. This critical role was demonstrated for Panamanian coral reefs in the early 1970s by elegant experiments. Well, there's the term that we saw. Following Peter Glynn's observation that trapezia crabs, I think I pronounced that properly, but those are just going to become T crabs if we care about it. And I'm not even going to try. A snapping shrimp living within branching, definitely not going to try that phrase, pea coral colonies prevented the crown of thorns starfish, and okay, that's its technical name, from feeding on the corals. Okay, so we know that it's about these scuba observations. And so we know that, excuse me, for PCRs, so Panamanian coral reefs just become PCRs. The experiments following PG's observation that basically some organisms, and we'll just call them orgs, stopped this starfish, and I know what a starfish is, so we'll hold with starfish, from feeding on the coral. So we just break it down into that piece, right? So we've got some level of experiments that are coming after this observation that some organisms stop starfish from feeding on coral. Then, corals. We then find out in the next sentence, pea colonies, again, I'm not going to try to pronounce that word, where protective symbionts were experimentally removed, suffered higher rates of destruction by that starfish. The AP is that starfish. And coral diversity was higher where the crown of thorns starfish was prevented from foraging. So these are the experiments. So S3 are the experiments showed that if remove those organisms, the shrimp and the crabs, then you had hurt reefs because they suffered higher rates of destruction, but the diversity was higher, so BD higher, where the starfish stopped from feeding by those other things. So again, was prevented from foraging, so that's what they did, and it's those shrimp and those crabs that stopped the starfish from eating the coral reefs. So then we keep going. Another example of positive interactions affecting foundation and species and ultimately species diversity comes from the Caribbean 4 reef slope. So here, it can be a really short little summary. We just got intro, another experiment showing that species interactions improve BD on a reef. Now on the Caribbean 4 reef slope, but I'm just going to go with the reef. It was hypothesized that sponges enhance the persistence of some sort of F corals on the steep 4 reef slope by binding the corals to the reef frame. So sentence 5 is just intro the hypothesis that sponges enhance a reef. We don't really care about how, we just got the sponges enhance the reef. Corals fell off the reef slope on manipulated reefs where divers removed the sponges from the coral interstices, resulting in elevated coral mortality. So we've got more experiments. So S6 is that if sponges removed, then we just use a little arrow here, we know that the reef mortality increased, and that's a bad thing for the reef. Later work in similar habitats showed that the underside of F corals supports an exceptionally high diversity of E invertebrates. So S7 just shows, or later work showed high BD on the underside of the corals that were mentioned before. Thus, the positive effect of sponges on F corals enhances community-wide biodiversity. So we know that S8, and again, you can see they get shorter as we go along, and that's often how how the passages work. We know that sponges lead to enhanced BD for reef in total. So it's not a short process. That's absolutely true. And we know, again, both on the quantitative and the verbal side, that the way the exam introduces difficulty is just by making you have more things to do. So you have to decide if this is worth the effort. It probably will take you somewhere between 3 to 5 minutes to break this stuff down and type it out. Obviously, it should go faster than we just did it together here, but that's a decision you have to make because there's going to be 3 or 4 questions about this, and we can use this information for the subsequent tasks that are introduced. So here, we've got our question, which is just asking which of the following would be most analogous to the elegant experiments mentioned in the passage. And we know those are basically sentences. We've got the experiment. So we've got sentence 4 is an elegant experiment where they basically removed the sponges and saw what happened. And then we had them remove the starfish and see what happened. So S4 through 7 is the sponges. And we know that S3 was the starfish. So we've just got to find something that would be matching this idea of that they introduced something or removed something and saw what happened. So a longitudinal study of the global population trends of an entire order of sea creatures. Well, these were really specific. So this just doesn't match what we read. And if you don't know what longitudinal means, then just focus on the entire order piece. Longitudinal means it goes for a long time. Each of these was pretty specific and short time frame. Then we've got a closely controlled experiment involving starfish observed outside of their natural habitat. Well, no, all of this is supposed to be inside the natural habitat. They went in and basically engaged with the habitat, and the scuba divers removed something, added something. So that's out as basically a reversal because it's supposed to be done where the reef is. An experiment conducted in a laboratory determining the roles of various organisms in protecting endangered reefs. Well, again, we're not supposed to be in a laboratory, so that's out as another reversal because it's supposed to be an elegant experiment in the field. Using scuba equipment to build artificial coral structures to investigate possible reactions with varying chemicals. This seems closer, but we were talking about real coral structures. So everything was supposed to be like real life, so that is also in context going to be a reversal of what we've talked about from the passage. Now, engaging a team of divers to physically relocate a species of seahorse from a coral reef habitat and observing the impact of the action. This is very similar. It just changes sponge and starfish for a seahorse, and this broadly matches what we would expect from the elegant experiments. So let's go ahead and clear out just this stuff, and we'll bring in one more question. So one of the tactics that the exam likes to do is they'll put your main idea question at the end of one of these denser passages. So here we're being asked, which of the following best describes the structure of the passage? And again, we already kind of have it all set up here in our passage map, so we probably can go straight to the elimination. So a claim is made, yeah, and that would be sentence 1 right there. And examples are provided as support for it. Wow, that actually went pretty smoothly because you're like, yeah, we got those 2 examples, those 2 experiments, those elegant experiments that proved that scuba did promote this idea. Now, a theory is given, maybe, but evidence provided for is provided for and against it. Well, no, not for and against. A new scientific methodology is introduced. Well, maybe, and then tested in the field. Again, do we know that it's a new methodology here? I don't know that definitively. I might say that this is a squiggle, but certainly not as good as the option we had up at A. A hypothesis is offered and then refuted. Well, it's not refuted. And one experiment is described. Well, the experiment isn't the first thing that is described. It's the theory. And so, again, this just illustrates how you can move more quickly through these questions once you've got that good sample passage or sentence-by-sentence passage map. So I know it's probably not your favorite thing to do to engage with these very dense, very technical passages, but go ahead and apply the sentence-by-sentence passage map to work through some practice passages and improve your performance on this relatively difficult aspect of the verbal section of the GMAT.